Hi everyone and welcome. What you see here are my African night crawlers. The African night crawlers, it was 1 month ago today. It was 30 days ago on the 16th of March when I harvested two separate African night crawler systems, and all the worms that came out of those two systems got placed into this one tub here. And then what I did with all the castings was I placed all those castings into this tub over here, and I've been hanging on to that, and as you can see, I've labeled that as not as ANC castings, but more as sort of a cocoon nursery. And, you know, after 30 days, you would have to think that those cocoons, most if not all of them, should have hatched by now. It's been 10 days since we last checked in on these. This system's been treated more or less like a regular bin, getting feedings. And over here, we've just been checking in to see how things are progressing. And I don't really remember if we saw any baby worms in here last time, but we're going to take a look. And at some point, we're probably going to want to try baiting those worms out of this system too. So I didn't really bring any food down here yet. I figured I would figure out what I want to do with these first. Then I would shoot up and get whatever it is that we need to feed them. So I'm going to get these up on the bench now, and we're going to get to work. So the container that we're starting with here, these are the cocoons, and it's really, I think, it's really going to depend on what's needed in this here system before I head upstairs to get food. Because I'm fairly certain that in the other system, I'm just going to bring down my normal portion of food, maybe 2 or 3 handfuls of food, and that's what's going to go into the regular worm bin. But here in the cocoon bin is where I'm uncertain about what might be needed to keep things moving in the right direction. Here I see a little worm. And I mean, here's another somewhat small couple juvenile worms. It's usually up here right near the plastic, underneath the plastic, where the moisture that's attempting to evaporate gets caught. And then the worms really come up here because they enjoy the moisture and the dampness that results from it being caught in the plastic. So I'm definitely starting to see some little tiny worms in here. And another one right there. They're super skinny. And I would have to guess that these are probably no more than a couple weeks old. There are quite a number of them here and there. I just always worry about leaving them out on the plastic, because then maybe they're going to start sensing the light overhead, they're going to start sensing the dryness, and that might get them trying to skedaddle, looking for a better spot to be. And then I just hate the idea of them somehow ending up on the dry paper cloth table and, you know, ending up unnoticed and ending up drying up over there. But I mean, that in itself is a pretty good sign. That probably tells us that it's about time to try rounding up the worms now that they're beginning to emerge from their cocoons and they're beginning to populate the material. Now, another thing that's been good at going into these systems has been some neem cake, and the neem cake is intended to try to tackle the mites. The mites really kind of came on the radar here with the African night crawlers. I started noticing a lot of the little white mites kind of taking over in my African night crawler systems. Look at all these little tiny baby worms everywhere, not only on the plastic but on the paper that was right beneath the plastic too. And some of them are so small they're, you know, very easy to miss. But I can also see the mites just kind of zipping along. The mites also favor the moisture, so it's not surprising to find them right out here on the damp paper. But I've been placing the neem cake powder, or the neem cake meal, into these systems, into pretty much all of my systems at this point. In systems like this, more as like an active countermeasure against the mites, and in other systems where I haven't even really seen mites yet, I've been doing it as sort of a proactive attempt at keeping their numbers from ever exploding. All these little tiny white specks that I see everywhere, I have to assume that those are also mites. They're really slow-moving critters, though, so it's kind of hard to tell. You can't really see them moving unless you just sort of take a little while and observe their movement over time. It's for that reason sometimes I'll shoot a little bit of time lapse over the course of a few minutes, just to be able to see their movement and to get a better sense of how many of them I've got. Little places like this too, where you can see a larger quantity of them over here as well, it becomes really clear how many you're dealing with. And I mean, some people might just brush that off and say, you know, it's hardly any. What are you making a big deal out of it for? I mean, I don't mind if there's a few, but you know, I'd prefer to try to reduce their numbers, mainly because it feels like I've been battling with them for so long now. I'd really love to see their numbers drastically reduced in all my systems. But you know what? I'm going to shoot a little bit of time-lapse footage for a few minutes at least, just so we can get a better sense of how many of them there are out here. And we should be able to better see them moving if we take about maybe 10 minutes worth of movement and compress it into just a few minutes or a few seconds, I mean. So let's do that. I couldn't help but notice this one little tiny worm over here. The entire time, it was just kind of writhing around as if it was being attacked or something. I feel bad for the little guy. It's kind of hard to tell what's going on there because it's, you know, kind of small. I wish I had a magnifying glass or something. But it seems like this little guy is like under attack or something. I wonder if these mites are, like, you know, causing this poor little worm some discomfort. I don't remember how long it's been since the application of the neem cake started in this container. It just may not have been enough time yet for it to have an effect on reducing the number of mites in the system. But I sure hope it starts working soon. I mean, I value the role that mites play in worm bins. They're kind of like the cleanup crew, and they take care of worms that have kind of died of natural causes and whatnot, but I'd hate to think that the mites that are in my systems are actually causing harm or death to my worms. Although some people have actually made mention of what they refer to as predatory mites. So I don't know if that's kind of one of the gotchas over here. So, you know, I guess I was trying to get a sense of whether it was time yet to try rounding up the baby worms in this system. I wanted to get a sense of how many of them there are in here. And I mean, just from what we observed on the top surface, the ones that were coming to take advantage of some of the moisture, that's clearly a sign that we're starting to get cocoons that are hatching. And I'm also able to still see, you know, cocoons here and there. They're all very dark in color, the ones that I do see. And it was just the fact that I did see cocoons at all, which was why I started into this whole effort of trying to round them up and to bait them out of the material. Over here on the edge, you might notice that the material looks a little bit different. It's like kind of a combination of little dry leaves, specks, and things like that. I'm pretty sure that this was where I had placed all of the larger chunks of material that didn't really go through the screening process, or large chunks of food that had not yet broken down. So in a way, I had already started into the creation of a feeding zone in this bin. So it's almost kind of like a placeholder. Sometimes I'll cover up those future feeding zones, if you will, with plastic to make sure that the moisture in there kind of gets enhanced a little bit, or gets a little bit more damp than what's in the rest of the container. And then maybe it becomes more of an appealing place for the worms to come to and hang out in or if they end up there to stay there. And I'm thinking at some point I might start baiting the baby worms in this system by putting some nice delicious food items over into this edge of the bin where the kind of the bedding has already been placed in here. If you've been watching my channel recently, you'll notice that I've been actually doing this in a couple different of my bins. Sort of setting up a little bit of a bedding area. And I was just wondering whether I would want to place food in here yet, if I was starting to see enough baby worms in here that it would start to make sense yet to try rounding them up. But I don't know if it's quite necessary yet. I think I'd like to maybe see some more. But you know, I'm heading upstairs anyway to get the food that's going to go into the regular worm bin. And since I've already kind of excavated a spot here, perhaps it wouldn't be a bad idea to just drop in a little bit of food here. I've even got some cardboard that I could place in under it as sort of a foundation for that, to sort of enhance what bedding's in here already. So yeah, why don't we do that? We're just going to go ahead and we're going to, I guess after 30 days, it also seems realistic to think that it's already about time for any cocoons that were in here to start hatching. So I'm going to go upstairs and grab some food with which we'll be able to go feed the next bin that we're going to bring out here, but with a little bit more, so we can also go ahead and we can set up this feeding area and start into the migration of whatever worms we can round up over here. So I'm going to take a short break, head upstairs to go fetch that, and we'll pick up where we left off momentarily. So I just got back from my freezer, and while everything over here was in the freezer, the ice, the coffee, that wasn't in the freezer. That's just right out of the coffee machine from last night. So I've got this stuff here. I've also got the NEEM seed meal, or the NEEM cake. And a couple other things I've got here is a little bit more extra coffee, since I've always got so much of that on hand. And since what we're doing here is setting up food that's intended for the little baby worms, I've got some pulverized eggshell here, which is going to serve as the grit, which is the food supplement that you always need to provide your baby worms with. All your worms with, really. That cardboard I showed earlier has been soaking in water also to get it nice and damp. So why don't we save that as sort of the topping material to place in on top of the food items. I've got this whole banana peel here. We'll just sort of spread it out across the feeding area. Sometimes you'll see me sort of segment the finished castings from the area where I'm trying to bait the worms over into. I don't know, I don't do it religiously. I guess it depends on whether or not I'm in the mood or not. Not to say I'm not necessarily in the mood, but I just didn't feel like going too over the top dealing with this today. I didn't even know if I'd be doing this today, but the fact that I saw some baby worms cruising around within the material on top of the newspaper, hanging out on the plastic when we first opened up the container, it seemed realistic to start into the migration of the babies, assuming that they're all going to start emerging soon. Also assuming that some have probably already emerged and we just didn't really see them. And I never really know how much to put into a feeding area that's intended for the baby worms, because it just seems like, you know, they're so puny. How much can they eat? So the grit is going to help them break down the food. The NEEM cake is really also, from what I understand, another thing that the worms definitely consider as a treat that they like to eat. But I'd really like for it to be, you know, I don't mind. I mean, I like the fact that the worms like it too, but I'm using it mainly because I want to try to rid myself of mites, basically. And I'm going to use some of this older coffee, which seems to have a little bit of mold growing on it, which is perfectly fine. The worms actually do like to eat that sort of stuff too. Pretty dry, this coffee here. It's been sitting around for a while, I guess. Lately I've been coming down with these filters with the coffee in them and using them. So all the stuff that I've put into those cartons has just kind of been sitting around for some time now. So even though we've got a good amount of like a lot of this uncomposted leafy material and paper bits and cardboard bits, all kinds of stuff that I'm assuming is already pretty good bedding materials. I'm adding a little bit more just for good measure out here on the top. I think between the cardboard coverings and the coffee coverings, we're shielding the food that we just added from becoming sort of an attractant for any sort of insects that might be flying by and might catch a whiff of the yummy banana peels and other things that are down in here. So I always like to somehow try to cover up the feeding area a little bit just so that it doesn't end up attracting pests. So that looks pretty good. I believe that was more or less what we were after. We put in the food, we put in the grit, we put in the neem seed meal, and I guess now we'll just sort of start backfilling a little bit. Try to move some of these larger chunks that were really over in the bedding area back over into the bedding area, so that what remains out here can really remain as mostly finished castings. And it really is nice stuff. Definitely some nice material. And you know, as I kind of look through it, I definitely see cocoons here and there. But for the most part, it's just a really nice, fine material, nice, fine worm castings. It was covered with plastic because I don't think it needs to dry much more. I mean, if I did allow the stuff to dry, then the baby worms would probably be a little bit more inspired to go looking for a more cozy, a more damp place to be. My hope is that they can kind of catch a whiff of the stuff that's over there. The nice savory foods, and that they'll be drawn to it just based on that. At least that's my hope. But we'll see. So after 30 days, since these castings were placed into here and given time for the cocoons in the material to start hatching out, we're now actually starting into the process of attempting to lure the babies out of the finished compost. And you know, at the same time with the neem seed meal, we're attempting to rid ourselves of these pesky mites too. So the plastic's going to go back on more or less the way we found it. It may not have been put on very thoroughly, which would have been fine. And I'm not going to worry about putting it on terribly thoroughly, except for on this edge over here, where I definitely want the moisture to remain down in the bin rather than potentially evaporating. I definitely want the moisture that's in here between the dampened cardboard as well as the moisture that's going to come off the frozen foods that we placed in there. I definitely want that stuff to remain nice and damp. But you know what? I almost forgot. I also want to lay out a little bit more of the neem seed cake, neem seed meal, whatever, for the mites. And usually I'll put it right onto the material itself. But just to give it a try, I'm going to see if placing it out here on top of the paper might even work better. So every time I open it up and there's nice dampness going on right beneath the plastic, that's where I seem to see the mites. And then when I remove the paper, I don't really feel like I see quite as many mites. So maybe the real place to lay out the stuff that's going to do away with the mites is where you see the greatest number of them. So I'm giving this a try. I'm always trying different things to see if something new that I try potentially has a better outcome or better result than the thing I was doing up until then. So we'll see how that goes. All right, very cool. Let's get this thing covered up again. And we can proceed with the feeding of the African nightcrawler bin, where we've got the adult worms. Okay. All right, so now one thing I did do since the last time we were in here is that I did remove plastic coverings off many of my systems. So I don't remember if this system was plastic covered or not. Probably wasn't, because this paper looks fairly new. So chances are it was covered in plastic, and I have since come back and removed the plastic. So I was just starting to worry that I was kind of keeping the bins a little bit too damp. So hopefully I haven't really swung things to the opposite direction and caused things to become overly dry. So we'll see. The other thing you're going to notice in here is the presence of a lot of this white powder. So in the very beginning I had used a whole bunch of diatomaceous earth in this system, again to deal with the mites. And in a certain sense I felt like I had really actually done quite a good job in tackling the mites in this particular system, because it did seem like, you know, the worms were looking pretty decent, but I didn't really see mites crawling around. Although if I kind of hold this material in my hand and I look carefully, I can certainly see a couple little something or another's cruising around. So like anything else, I'm sure the diatomaceous earth probably wouldn't have wiped out every last single mite, but hopefully it's helping to reduce their numbers over time. So I've been wanting to come in here each time afterwards, after the initial launch of this bin 30 days ago, and try to keep blending in this diatomaceous earth so that it's not sitting in big clumps all over the place. And I think over time, as we blend it in, it should kind of vanish out of view. Really nice castings down at the bottom of this container for only 30 days. I'm pretty surprised. And it's not surprising that the worms are kind of sticking to the bottom end of the container, since the upper layers are kind of dry from not having had the plastic coverings. And that, I think, is a little bit of the downside to not using plastic coverings. I definitely like having the plastic coverings because that makes, you know, the material throughout the bin, high and low, deep, shallow, you know, it all becomes nice and damp, and then the worms pretty much feel comfortable going into all areas of the bin. They don't, you know, feel compelled to dive down deep where they're going to find nice damp materials. They'll find damp materials all over the place when the plastic's recirculating the moisture within the bin. So I'm wondering if it might be a good idea to put plastic back on this one, but maybe just in a way that doesn't stifle the airflow. But then again, you know, a fairly new system like this, the material is pretty airy, pretty, you know, large chunks of stuff, you know, so it's not like a really mature bin where the material kind of compacts and gets really dense. So I don't think there's really any reason to concern ourselves about airflow in a fairly new container like this. So I believe I am probably going to revert back to having a plastic covering on here. I just came down here because I was having issues in some of my bins, and I was starting to blame a lack of airflow on my problems. And I figured, you know, I'm going to just go ahead and replace all my plastic coverings, or at least most of them, with just paper. But in this particular case, it may have been sort of a knee-jerk reaction, and I think the paper, I think the plastic coverings going back on would probably actually serve a greater benefit, at least for a little while, until such a time that the worms really do work more of this material down. So the last feeding would have been applied down the center, so I'm saving that for last with the assumption that that's where we're going to find the greatest number of worms hanging out. So, and that's where we're going to put today's food in too. So let's open up an opening down the middle to first see how the previous portion of food is coming along. Wow, nice turnout over here, right? This might be some of the coffee. It looks kind of like coffee and kind of like bedding, but here we've got a pretty good size jumble of worms. And whatever it is that they came over to enjoy, to eat, I don't see any signs of it. Unless it's the coffee itself that they were coming over to eat. But it's usually my guess that it was some of the other stuff that was put in here during the last feeding that they came over to eat, that they're probably still over here enjoying. And I believe right underneath this end too, I'm seeing a pretty good size jumble of worms. Don't forget, these are the worms that came out of two separate systems, so it's not surprising that we've got a fairly large worm population in this container. And the castings are also looking quite nice down there too. Perhaps even more castings down the middle than anywhere else, because that's where all the food is and all the action is. So there's probably not a great deal of need for more bedding, but I do feel like I'm kind of a Scrooge when it comes to the application of bedding in some of my systems. So my idea was to maybe try to thaw out my Scrooge heart and become a little bit more generous with the bedding for these little guys. So why don't we just sort of create a nice big crevice where the feeding had been previously, pushing most of it aside. Then I've still got all of this cardboard here. I don't think we need to use all of it, but I figured let's use at least a few chunks to go hand in hand with the food we're giving them today. Right? That's a pretty nice, generous portion of additional bedding to add to today's feeding. Not to mention the fact that this this coffee filter right here also serves as bedding too, right? So let's try to spread today's application of coffee around a little bit more instead of stacking it all up in one place. This way it might get a little bit better attention from the wormies. Now, there's no particular order to any of this stuff, so we can drop in some of our grit. I'm going to drop in a little bit of the neem cake over here. And then we've got our portion of food, which, looking at all those worms, makes me wonder if they could probably do with even more. They probably could. Although, I got to remember that they also, at least these night crawlers, they do seem to treat the bedding as a pretty viable food source as well. So I think between all the stuff that we just dropped in here with all the fresh bedding and all the fresh veggies and fruit and coffee, I think we're setting them up in a pretty good way for possibly another 10 days. After 30 days, we've had 3 visits, so on average we're checking in on about a 10-day interval. I believe it was 11 days after the initial first check-in from the time the bin was initially launched. And then after that, it was, I believe, a 9-day pause between that first check-in and the second check-in, and then this most recent interval was 10 days. So over 30 days with 3 check-ins, we're averaging a 10-day interval between the check-ins. And that seems to be working pretty good in this system. So, the only thing that I need to do now is, like I said, I'm kind of treating the application of this neem cake as sort of a staple item, at least for a little while in my bins, just because I'd really like to see a massive reduction of mites in all my systems. And like I said earlier, the worms, from what I understand, also treat this stuff as kind of a treat, so they enjoy the food. So I'm going to lay some of this stuff down, but we'll save a little bit to lay on top of the paper that we're going to put on top too, because after we put the plastic on, this should become a nice damp spot that the worms are going to congregate on and come up onto to take advantage of the moisture. So let's lay this stuff out here, because besides the worms coming up for the moisture, I would also have to assume that mites will also do the same, since the mites definitely dig the moisture. So there's a big pile of neem cake there. I'm even thinking, you know, do I want to put that other piece of paper back on now? Or do I want to swap it out with plastic? Maybe we use both. Maybe we'll put that on top and we'll just have that sort of intermediate layer. I just feel like they're going to squash together once the moisture starts recirculating in here. But I definitely want to cover up with a little bit of plastic. Maybe not as thoroughly as in other systems, but I definitely want to get some plastic on here. And what a lot of people recommend is the use of bubble wrap with the bubbles facing down, so that, you know, to a large degree, you do prevent excess evaporation from happening, but with the gaps between the bubbles, you also allow for a little bit of airflow. So it's kind of bringing the benefits of the evaporation vapor barrier without stifling airflow in the material. So let's see how that goes. I think it should go pretty good. So that's it for today's video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.